GPU prices have finally started to fall back in line to reasonable levels, and for once, gamers have a choice as to what they want to buy due to supply settling down, and there are some deals to be had. So we thought it'd be a great time to take a look at some of the most popular models on the market in a good old-fashioned showdown between the RX 6700, RTX 3060 and RTX 3060 Ti. The RX 6700 is a model that never saw an official launch, or an official launch price for that matter, but is shown to offer amazing performance and great value for money, especially with a price point of $350 or £360, which at that price point makes an interesting talking point, considering an RTX 3060 can be had for $370 or £350 and an RTX 3060 Ti for about $450 or £440. So it all comes down to performance. Now obviously we know that Nvidia will have the upper hand when it comes to ray tracing, but as we also know, not everyone is sold on ray tracing and prefer to just focus on pure rasterization, though we will be looking at both in this video. So Sapphire reached out to us by sponsoring this video and sending over their RX 6700 Pulse card that they believe offers superior value for money based on the performance it has to offer. So of course, we jumped at the chance to see who would be victorious for those wanting to game at 1080p and 1440p with some even, high refresh gaming thrown in for good measure too. Now it's been a while since we did any form of head-to-head showdown, and this is probably one of the more interesting ones that we're looking at in recent months. So card-wise, we have the Sapphire RX 6700, the MSI RTX 3060 and the MSI 3060 Ti, of which both MSI cards are higher spec cards, so they would actually demand a slight premium over a more basic model 3060 and 3060 Ti. So if anything, that adds more variables into the mix, as they will offer up more performance, but will cost more money. And we'll be looking at cost per frame a little later on to see how things stack up too. So to make things as fair as possible, we scoured the internet for the very So to make things as fair as possible, we scoured the internet for the very best price on the models that we have here, and the Sapphire comes in quite a bit cheaper than both models in both the US and the UK, with the Pulse card coming in at $349.99 in the US and $359.99 in the UK, while the 3060 Gaming-X Trio comes in at $444 in the US and $429.98 in the UK, and the MSI RTX 3060 Ti Gaming-X Trio is available for $544 in the US and £496.84 in the UK. Now, to keep things as fair as possible, we're using all of the same components for our testing, with the only change being the GPU itself. And we tested across 3 resolutions, though due to the market they're aimed at, we will be focusing more on the 1080p and 1440p data as we muddle through. Now for our testing, we used our main GPU test system, consisting of an Asus Z690 Maximus Hero motherboard with an Intel i9-12900K processor, cooled by a Noctua NHD 15 Chromax Black. Memory-wise, we used 32GB of Patriot Viper Venom DDR5 running at 6200MHz and a Seagate Firecuda 530 NVMe SSD. For all of our testing, we used Windows 11 21H2, and the Nvidia cards were tested on the 527.62 driver, while the 6700 was tested on the 20.40.00.57 driver. So starting things off with a Plague Tale Requiem, where things initially aren't looking so good for the RX 6700, falling a bit behind the 3060 with 12% fewer FPS at 1080p and 16% at 1440p. The RX 6700 falls even further behind the 3060 Ti with a 22% difference in FPS at 1080p and the same for 1440p. This game, however, does have a fairly strong preference for Nvidia cards, so things can easily change as we look at some more games. Like for example, our next game, Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Here we see the 6700 taking a lead over both 3060 cards at 1080p and 1440p, with 1080 seeing a huge 14% improvement in FPS over the 3060 Ti and a monumental 47% increase over the 3060 at 1080p. And then at 1440p, the 6700 saw a 39% increase in FPS over the 3060 and a 9% improvement in performance over the 3060 Ti. Moving on to our next game, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. Here we saw the 6700 and the 3060 Ti almost neck and neck throughout all 3 resolutions, with only a slight edge in favour of the Nvidia card. At 1080p, it's so close there's not even 1% between them, while at 1440p it's much of the same story, with such a small percentage difference that it's unrecognisable in gameplay. The 3060 performed very poorly in comparison here, with 36% less frames than the 6700 at 1080p and 32% less at 1440p. Next up is Control, another game with a preference to Nvidia, and here we see the 6700 sitting closer to the non-TI version, with a decent 9% improvement in FPS at 1080p and a slightly smaller 7% improvement at 1440p in favour of the 6700. Compared to the 3060 Ti, however, the 6700 sits 20% fewer frames at 1080p and 25% fewer at 1440p, which is admittedly a lot larger, but the 6700 does come in quite a bit cheaper. Cyberpunk is next, and we are starting to see a bit of a trend forming now, with the 6700 sitting somewhere between the two 3060 cards. At 1080p, we saw the 6700 sitting 16% lower in performance compared to the 3060 Ti, and then compared to the 3060, the 6700 sits at 13% higher in performance. While looking at 1440p, we have an 18% increase in performance between the 6700 and the 3060 Ti, while comparing the 6700 to the 3060, we see another 11% improvement for the AMD card. Death Stranding is next, and here we see some interesting results with just under a 2% lead in performance at 1080p in favour of the RX 6700, while at 1440p the 3060 Ti commands a 4% lead, but comes in costing more. The 3060 remained below both cards in all resolutions in this title, with 32% lower performance at 1080p compared to the 6700 and 28% lower at 1440p. In Destroy All Humans 2, we see the 6700 performing the worst of the three cards at 1080p, coming in 4% lower than the 3060 and 8% lower than the Ti. But things change a little when we move up to 1440p, with the 6700 now sitting 24% lower than the Ti, but sits 7% higher than the 3060 non-Ti. Next up is Doom Eternal, of which this game is pretty great for running amazingly on pretty much anything. And we can see this being reflected perfectly well in the fact that at 1080p, we are bordering on 300 FPS on the RX 6700. When we compare the performance of the cards, we see the 6700 taking a lead at 1080p, sitting with 3% more performance than the 3060 Ti and 21% more than the 3060. Things make a slight change when we move up to 1440p, now with the 6700 still sitting above the 3060 with 13% more performance, but it now sits below the 3060 Ti with 10% lower performance. Dying Light 2 comes next, and 1080p sees the 6700 outperforming the 3060 with 17% more performance, but once again sitting below the Ti, albeit at a smaller difference with only a 13% lead to the 3060 Ti. Things stay similar at 1440p, with the 6700 performing worse than the Ti by 14% and performing better than the 3060 by around 17%, which places the performance of the 6700 between the two Nvidia cards. F122 is following much of the same story, with the 6700 sitting somewhere between the competition in all resolutions. Compared to the 3060, the 6700 has more performance in both 1080p and 1440p, having 19% and 29% more performance in 1080p and 1440p respectively. When comparing the 6700 against the 3060 Ti, we see a smaller difference between the two cards, with only a 6% drop in performance at 1080p and only 8% at 1440p. Far Cry 6 has the same general performance difference between the cards. At 1080p, the 6700 performed only 5% lower than the Ti, whilst performing 24% better than the non-Ti card. While at 1440p, we see the 6700 performing 12% lower than the Ti and 18% better than the 3060. Our next game, Horizon Zero Dawn, proves to be a bit more difficult for the 6700, sitting below both other cards in this test. At 1080p, the AMD card performed 9% lower than the 3060 and 16% lower than the Ti variant, which sounds worse than it is, as all three cards did manage to get average frame rates well over 100. So it's still more than playable. 1440p also stayed perfectly playable but with slightly lower performance, but it also brought the performance of the 6700 closer to the 3060, now with only a 5% difference between the two cards. 1440p also made a bigger difference between the AMD card and the 3060 Ti, moving up to a 21% difference in performance in favour of Nvidia. Next up is Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered, which is another game with preference to Nvidia, with the biggest difference in performance between the 6700 and the Ti at 1080p, with the 3060 Ti sitting 29% faster. But like we've seen before, the 3060 struggles to stay far ahead with a much smaller performance difference over the 6700 of just 5%. At 1440p, we start to see the 3060 struggle to keep up, so much that it ends up with 1 FPS lower performance than the 6700 that it had managed to outperform at 1080p. The performance difference between the 6700 and the 3060 Ti also narrowed, now only sitting with 15% between them. Microsoft Flight Sim was, well, it was Flight Sim. Performance is somewhat unpredictable in this game at the best of times, generally bottlenecked by the CPU. Now at 1080p though, the 6700 was only barely above the 3060 in performance, while the difference between the AMD card and the Ti is again much larger, with a 25% difference in average frames per second. 1440p sees a smaller gap between the 6700 and the 3060 Ti, now at 18%, but we also see the 6700 falling just behind the 3060 by around 6%. Our final game is Watch Dogs Legion, and despite this game having a slight bias towards Nvidia, the RX 6700 still manages to stretch its legs quite a bit, staying pretty far ahead of the 3060 at both 1080p by 27% and at 1440p by 21%. Compared to the 3060 Ti, it does come in faster than the 6700 by a small 4% margin at 1080p, while 1440p sees a larger gap of 9% in favour of Nvidia. So lots of games, and for the most part, the results were very interesting, especially when going into this armed with the price points of all cards, which I will go through when looking at cost per frame very shortly. Now what is worth looking at, however, is how all three of the cards perform over the resolutions as an overall average. Because while some cards will perform better in certain titles, looking at the overall average can give kind of a better idea as to how rounded a card is across multiple titles. Because, well, no one's buying a GPU to just play one game for the rest of their lives, typically speaking. Now what we found here is that the RX 6700 sits between the results of both the RTX 3060 and 3060 Ti in all three resolutions. This is pretty much what I expected from the get-go, but does make for an interesting look when talking about pricing, because if it performs better but costs less, well, that's a win-win. Now when looking at the cost per frame, again the RX 6700 sits between the RTX 3060 and the 3060 Ti. Though at all three resolutions, it actually sits much closer to the much more expensive 3060 Ti. So while you could argue that the Ti does give better value per se, it also costs more. And anyone would like to think that if you spend more, you get more. While the RX 6700 clearly shows that if you spend less, you still get more to a degree. Now in the UK, it's very much the same story, with the cost per frame being dramatically closer to the much more expensive 3060 Ti. So if you are on a strict budget that you simply can't go over, then, well, the choice is pretty clear when looking at things from a value for money point of view, which anyone who's watched any of our videos will know that's what I'm all about. So obviously this is all based on pure rasterization, but that's not where these cards stop, as they do, all three of them, have the ability to harness the power of ray tracing and of course their very own upscaling technologies like DLSS and FSR. So to get a better understanding as to what this means, we'll be focusing on those aspects here, but we have included the original FPS in the charts to make the difference kind of more transparent. And for the sake of comparison, all data recorded for ray tracing and upscaling was taken at 4K, as this proved kind of the best to see how performance drops and can be gained from the upscaling technologies. It also gives you scope that if you do want to lower the resolution, you know you're going to get more performance. Starting things off with Control, which admittedly is biased towards Nvidia as FSR isn't even supported, but still a nice way of seeing how ray tracing makes a difference to the overall performance of each card. And when looking at the difference between the RX 6700 and the RTX 3060, where there's only 3 frames per second difference between them. Though at such a low level, it still means that the 3060 comes in 23% faster overall. Though at less than 30 FPS, it's unlikely something you'd want to run anyway. Moving over to Cyberpunk 2077, again we see a clear favour towards Nvidia, with the 6700 dropping from 17 to 3 FPS on average, putting it 166% worse performing than the 3060 in ray tracing. For whatever reason, likely due to the memory size, the 3060 Ti performed worse than its little brother, with only a 66% jump compared to the 6700. When we moved on to upscale the game, we saw a pretty huge jump in performance across the board, with the 6700 managing to jump up from a measly 3 FPS to 20 FPS, which isn't great by modern standards, but it's enough that you could still play the game and it gives you an idea as to what can be done at lower resolutions. The upscaling wasn't quite as strong on this card as on the Nvidia cards, falling 25% below the 3060 and 60% below the 3060 Ti. But again, with both cards coming in more expensive, it's not exactly worth it. The only other game we're looking at for ray tracing performance is Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered, which shows exactly the same thing that we saw in Cyberpunk in terms of where performance stands. When we enabled it on the 6700, we dropped from an average of 49 FPS to 24, which is still enough to play the game, though compared to the ray tracing performance of the 3060, the 6700 performed about 12% worse, and then 41% lower than the Ti version. When we then turn on upscaling, we go up to 43 FPS on the 6700, which doesn't quite reach the same performance as without any ray tracing, but it's still a good jump overall. The upscale performance on the 6700 ended up sitting 30% lower than the 3060 and 27% lower than the Ti, again likely due to the memory. Interestingly, the 3060 was the only card of the three that had the upscaling results outperform the standard performance. And again, it was always clear that Nvidia have the upper hand in ray tracing, but again, you're going to be expected to pay for it. So there we have it. I think it's safe to say that all cards performed very well across the board, but it's very hard to ignore the RX 6700, which showed strong performance for a much lower price point. And if you're not bothered about ray tracing, is the clear kind of outright winner, and from a brand that you know and trust. So what do you think? What card would you be eyeing up, especially if you're limited by that budget? Well, I think it's pretty easy to see. And with that, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And a big shout out to Sapphire for sponsoring this video. Also, if you love what we do, then consider supporting us over on Patreon, where you'll get a ton of exclusive benefits, including monthly live Q&A sessions, exclusive behind the scenes content, and much more. The link for all that good stuff is down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys.